This is Chapter 5, Section 1, Taxation Without Representation, beginning on page 122, American Diary. In London, Benjamin Franklin stated the American view on British taxes, quote, "They will oppose it to the last. They do not consider it as at all necessary for you to raise money by your taxes. America has been greatly misrepresented as refusing to bear any part of the war's expense. The colonies paid and clothed near 25,000 men during the last war, a number equal to that of Britain." Close quote. In an interview before the House of Commons, 1766. Relations with Britain, main idea. After the French and Indian War, Great Britain passed laws to protect British interests in the colonies. History in you. How do you feel when someone treats you unfairly? Read to learn how the colonists felt about British laws that affected them. With victory in the French and Indian War, the British gained control of a vast territory in North America. However, they faced the challenge of protecting their interests in the colonies and new territory. With the proclamation of 1763, the British government set up new provinces. The proclamation also prohibited or prevented colonists from moving west of the Appalachian Mountains. Limiting Western settlement provided several advantages for Britain. It allowed the British government to control westward movement and to avoid conflict with Native Americans. Also, keeping colonists near the East Coast ensured a market for British goods in the coastal cities where trade flourished. Finally, closing westward settlement allowed Britain to control the fur trade in the frontier. Britain planned to station 10,000 troops in the colonies to protect these interests. Britain needed new revenue or incoming money to pay troop expenses. Also, the French and Indian War left Britain with a huge debt. The king and parliament believed that the colonists should pay part of the cost, so they issued new taxes on the colonies and began to enforce existing taxes more strictly. Britain's trade laws. In 1763, George Grenville, Prime Minister of Britain, decided to act against smuggling. When the colonists smuggled goods to avoid taxes, Britain lost revenue. Grenville knew that American juries often found smugglers innocent. He convinced Parliament to pass a law allowing smugglers to be sent to vice admiralty courts, which were run by officers and did not have juries. In 1767, Parliament authorized writs of assistance. These legal documents allowed customs officers to enter any location to search for smuggled goods. The Sugar Act. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act. This act lowered the tax on imported molasses. Grenville hoped the lower tax would convince colonists to pay the tax instead of smuggling. The act also let officers seize goods from smugglers without going to court. The Sugar Act and the new laws to control smuggling angered colonists. They believed these British actions violated or interfered with their rights as English citizens. Writs of assistance violated their right to be secure in their homes. Vice admiralty courts violated their right to a jury trial. Also, in vice admiralty courts, defendants had to prove their innocence. This contradicted a British law stating, quote, "innocent until proved guilty," close quote. These measures alarmed the colonists. James Otis, a lawyer in Boston, argued, primary source, quote, "no parts of England's colonies can be taxed without their consent. Every part has a right to be represented," close quote, from the rights of the British colonies. Reading check. Explaining, why did George Grenville want smugglers sent to vice admiralty courts? New taxes, main idea. As the British government passed new tax laws, resistance by the colonists grew. History in you. Suppose everyone in your community refused to buy from a certain store. How would this decision affect the store? Read to learn how boycotts by the colonists affected British merchants. In 1765, Parliament passed the Stamp Act. This law placed a tax on almost all printed material, including newspapers, wills, and playing cards. All printed material had to have a stamp. British officials applied the stamp after the tax was paid. Opposition to the Stamp Act centered on 2 points. Parliament had interfered in colonial affairs by taxing the colonies directly. In addition, it taxed the colonists without their consent. Protesting the Stamp Act. A member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, Patrick Henry, persuaded the Burgesses to take action against the Stamp Act. The Virginia Assembly passed a resolution, a formal expression of opinion declaring it had, quote, the only and sole exclusive right and power to lay taxes, close quote, on its citizens. In Boston, Samuel Adams helped start an organization called the Sons of Liberty to protest the Stamp Act. People in other cities also organized the Sons of Liberty groups. Protesters burned effigies or rag figures representing tax collectors and destroyed houses belonging to royal officials. In October, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York at the Stamp Act Congress. They drafted a petition to the king and Parliament declaring that the colonies could not be taxed except by their own assemblies. In colonial cities, people refused to use the stamps. They urged merchants to boycott or refuse to buy British and European goods in protest. Thousands of merchants signed non-importation agreements, pledges not to buy or use goods imported from Britain. As the boycott spread, British merchants lost so much business that they begged Parliament to repeal or cancel the Stamp Act. In March 1766, Parliament repealed the law. However, on the same day, it passed the Declaratory Act. This law stated that Parliament had the right to tax and make decisions for the British colonies in all cases. The Townshend Acts. In 1767, Parliament passed a set of laws that came to be known as the Townshend Acts. British leaders knew from the Stamp Act that the colonists would resist internal taxes, those paid inside the colonies. As a result, the new taxes would apply only to imported goods such as glass, tea, and paper, with the tax being paid at the port of entry. By this time, any British taxes angered the colonists. They believed that only their own representatives had the right to tax them. The colonists organized another boycott. Throughout the colonies, women formed groups, sometimes called the Daughters of Liberty. They urged Americans to wear homemade fabric and produce other goods they needed rather than buy British goods. Reading check. Describing how did the Sons of Liberty attempt to influence British policy? Section 1 Review. Define each of the following: prohibit, revenue, writs of assistance, violate, resolution, effigy, boycott, non-importation, repeal. Number 2, specifying what advantages did the British gain by limiting westward settlement. Number 3, explaining why did some colonists smuggle goods. Number 4, identifying opposition to the Stamp Act centered on what 2 main points. Critical thinking. 5, contrasting how did the British and the colonists differ on the issue of taxes. And finally, answer the essential question at the end. Following the French and Indian War, how did the British government anger the American colonists? That is the end of Chapter 5, Section 1.